Sold off still bruised and bleeding at 19, she was bought by a gentle rancher. The auctioneer's gavel came down before I even raised my hand. That's how fast it happened. I want you to understand that. I didn't go there to buy a person. I went to Carver's stockyards that Tuesday morning to look at a pair of draft horses that Emmett Carver had advertised in the territorial paper. 2 Belgian geldings, 16 hands, said to be sound and trained to double harness. That was the whole of my plan. I had a list in my coat pocket with 3 items on it: horses, feed merchant, hardware store. Nothing else. I was standing at the rail when they brought her out. I didn't know what I was looking at first second. The light was bad, low winter sun cutting sideways through the slat boards of the pen, and all I saw was a shape being moved. Then she stepped into the open and I saw her face and I understood, and the thing that happened in my chest right then was not something I could have named for you. It wasn't pity exactly. It was closer to recognition of a wrong. A specific, deliberate wrong being done in front of me, and in front of 40 other men who were standing around with their hands in their pockets doing nothing. She was maybe 19. Dark hair loose and matted on one side where something had dried in it. One eye swollen, mostly shut, the color of a 3-day bruise going purple to yellow at the edges. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, pinned closed with a piece of wire. She stood the way you stand when you've been taught recently and forcefully that standing straight gets you hit again, slightly folded at the middle, chin down. But her one good eye, that eye was moving, taking inventory of the pen, the men, the gate, the distances. She wasn't gone. Whatever they'd done to her, they hadn't gotten to whatever lived behind that eye. The man running it wasn't Carver. It was a man named Dolph Reese, who did a kind of informal business out of Carver's yard when Carver wasn't present, debts collected in flesh. Women passed between outfits that had use for them. The county sheriff knew about it and considered it a private matter. I knew about it the way every rancher in that territory knew about it. The way you know about a thing you've told yourself isn't your problem. Reese was talking. Price for services rendered, he said. Debt her family owed, he said. Legal tender accepted, he said, and he had the nerve to grin when he said it. The men at the rail were looking her over the way they'd look at a filly. A few of them I knew. Harold Stitt from over the mountain. The Bauer brothers. A man named Corley who ran a road ranch 6 miles south and whose name I will leave there without further comment. My hand went up. I don't know that I decided it. I've thought about it in the years since, tried to locate the moment of decision, and I can't find it. My hand went up and my mouth said a number, and Reese looked at me with an expression I couldn't read and said sold, and that was that. Her name was Calla Drum. She told me that in the wagon on the way out of town, unprompted. I hadn't asked. I was watching the road and trying to think through what exactly I'd just done, and she said, quietly into the space between us, Calla Drum. My father was James Drum. He had a quarter section north of Millhaven before the bank took it. I said, Harlan Cross. I've got a ranch 12 miles out. She nodded once and looked at the road. We didn't talk again until we were out of town and into open country. The wind was coming off the flat and the horses leaned into it without complaint, good animals, and I kept thinking I should say something to her, something that would explain the situation, reassure her, establish what my intentions were and weren't. Every sentence I started in my head sounded wrong. Too much, or too little, or the wrong kind of careful. So I said nothing. After a while she said, What do you want me to do? Not a question. A request for terms. Clear-eyed and practical from a person who'd learned that sentimentality gets you nowhere, and what matters is knowing what's expected of you. I said, There's a room off the kitchen, separate door, you can bolt it from inside. I said, You'll eat with me, I cook, you don't have to if you don't want to. I need help with the ledgers, my handwriting's poor and my arithmetic's worse. When you're healed up enough to ride, I could use help moving stock. I thought a moment and then I said, That's about it. She looked at me for long enough that I felt it. "That's it," I said again. She turned back to the road, didn't say anything, but something in the way she was sitting changed. The folded-in posture eased very slightly by about half an inch. I noticed it because I'd been watching for it without knowing I was watching for it. The room off the kitchen had been my wife's sewing room. Me had been gone 11 years. I hadn't changed it much. Her sewing box was still on the shelf. Her chair still sat at an angle to the window she'd liked. I stood in the doorway while Calla looked around the room, and I felt the specific discomfort of a man who has kept something as a museum and is now suddenly embarrassed by it. I said there were blankets in the chest. I said the bolt on the door was new and solid. I'd put it in myself 2 winters back. I said there was a basin and a pitcher on the stand, and I'd heat water in the morning. She was looking at the chair. She said, "Was this someone's?" I said, "My wife's, she died." Calla nodded. She didn't say she was sorry, and I was glad she didn't. She just nodded the way you nod at a fact. She said, "I won't move her things." I said she could move whatever she wanted. It was her room. She said, "I won't move them," and that was the end of it. The first 2 weeks were mostly silence. She slept long hours, which was right, she needed them. She came to the table when I cooked, ate without comment, helped clear without being asked. She moved through the house carefully, like someone who'd learned that taking up space was an invitation to trouble, and it took a while before she started to move normally. You don't notice that kind of thing leaving a person, the caution, the flinching at sounds. It leaves so gradually that you only realize it's gone when you catch yourself listening for it, and it isn't there. Her eye healed. The bruising went through its colors and faded. The cut at her hairline left a thin scar that I don't think she minded. She was a plainly pretty woman once the damage cleared, dark-eyed, with a directness in her face that I came to think of as the signature of who she was. She looked at things straight, without squinting or looking away. On the 16th day, she came into the kitchen in the morning and put her hands on the table and said, "Show me the ledgers." I showed her the ledgers. They were a disaster. 3 years of poor record-keeping, numbers scratched out and rewritten, a column of figures from the fall cattle sale that didn't reconcile with anything else on the page. She sat down and looked at the first one for about 3 minutes without speaking, turning pages, and then she looked up and said, "How long have they been like this?" I said, "Since my wife." She said, "Your wife did them." I said, "She did everything that required thinking." Something moved across her face, not quite a smile, close enough that I noticed it and then it was gone. She said, "I'll need a new ledger book and a decent pen." I drove to town the next morning and bought both. Word got around the way it does. A rancher takes a woman off Reese's auction, brings her home. People have to decide what they think about that. Some decided I'd gone soft, or gone strange, or gone something they didn't have a word for. The Bauer boys, at the feed merchant one afternoon, made a remark that I let pass. I did not always let things pass. I let that one pass because I was thinking, and because the thought I was having was more important than whatever Bauer had to say. The thought I was having was that I hadn't been angry in a long time. Not at anything real. Not the kind of anger that clarifies things, that tells you what matters and what doesn't. I'd been flat, had been for years, if I was honest about it. The ranch ran, the seasons turned, the cattle were bought and sold, and I went to bed and got up, and there was nothing wrong with any of it and nothing particularly right with any of it either. Me's absence had hollowed something out that I'd mostly just learned to walk around. I wasn't soft on Calla. I want to be plain about that. I was not a lonely old man mooning over a young woman. She was not a replacement, and I was not a fool. What I was, I think, was reminded of what it felt like to have something to protect, to have a reason to set your feet and stand. That is not a small thing for a man to be reminded of. Dolph Reese came in March. He came with 2 men I didn't know, on a cold gray morning when the sky was the color of a cast-iron pan. I saw them from the barn. I recognized Reese's way of sitting a horse, a little back in the saddle, like he was always watching a show, and I took my time finishing what I was doing before I walked out to meet them. He sat on his horse and looked down at me and smiled the way men like Reese smile, like the smile itself is a kind of pushing. He said he'd come about the woman. I said, what about her? He said it had come to his attention that the debt situation he described was somewhat more complicated than he'd represented at the time of sale. He said there were additional parties with a claim on the woman's service. He said this in the language of business, calm and unhurried. I said, she's not for sale and she's not returnable. You took my money. He said the money was a consideration against future settlement, not a full satisfaction of the original obligation. I said, get off my land. He kept the smile. He said we could discuss it further, that reasonable men could come to arrangements. He said it the way men say things when what they mean is that you are not currently being reasonable, but you will be. I said, I won't tell you again. The two men with him hadn't moved. They were positioned the way hired men position themselves when they've been told to be ready, loose in the saddle, hands free. I knew what that meant. I'd been in the territory long enough to know what that meant. Reese looked at me for a long moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat, the way men do when they want you to know this isn't over, and they turned and rode out. I stood and watched them go until they were off my land and onto the county road. Then I went inside. Calla was at the table with the ledger open. She'd heard everything. The kitchen window was cracked. It was mild enough for that. She'd have heard every word. She didn't look up from the ledger immediately. She finished the line she was writing. Then she looked up. I said, he'll be back. She said, I know. I said, I'm going to ride to Millhaven tomorrow. The sheriff there is different from the county sheriff. His name is Aldous, Walt Aldous. He's straight. I'm going to tell him the situation. She was watching my face. I said, I want you to have the rifle. The Winchester, it's in the front room. You know how to use a rifle. She said, my father taught me. I said, all right. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she said quietly, why are you doing this? I said, because it's right. She said, that's not the whole answer. I held her gaze. I said, no, I don't suppose it is. She nodded that single, weighing nod she had and went back to the ledger. Walt Aldous was the kind of lawman who listened before he spoke, which is rarer than it ought to be. I sat across from him in his office in Millhaven and laid out the situation, Reese's operation, the auction, the debt claim, the visit. Aldous didn't write anything down. He just listened with his hands flat on the desk. When I was done, he said, I know about Reese. I said, most people know about Reese. He said, knowing and being able to act on it are two different hills. He was quiet a moment. Then he said, you have anything on paper, a receipt of sale? I did. I'd kept it. I took it out of my coat and put it on his desk. He looked at it. He said, this is his signature. I said, that's his signature. He looked at it another moment. He said, I'll ride out to see Reese. I said, that'll accomplish what exactly? He said, it'll let him know you've been to see me. Men like Reese do their work in the dark. You shine a light on them, some of them find another corner. He paused. Then he said, and if he doesn't, I'll hear about it and then I'll come out to your place. It wasn't a promise of safety. It was a promise of witness. It was more than I'd had before I walked in the door. Reese didn't come back right away. What he did instead was talk. In the way of towns, the talk got back to me through channels, a word to the feed merchant, a word at the lumber yard, a word in the barber shop. The talk was that I'd bought a damaged woman and was making a fool of myself over her. The talk was that she'd come from rough circumstances, and rough circumstances leave their mark on a person. The talk was delivered with a knowing look, and a particular kind of sympathy that meant its opposite. I didn't answer it. I'm not a man who answers talk. What I did was continue to do what I'd been doing, run my ranch, pay my bills, be visible in town when I needed to be, and be back on my land by dark. But I noticed something. The men who'd been standing at the rail that morning at Carver's yard, the ones who'd bid or considered bidding or stood by without bidding, those men did not look at me the same way after I went to see Aldous. A few of them found reasons not to meet my eye. The Bauer boys stopped making remarks. Harold Stitt, who I'd known 20 years, crossed the street to shake my hand one afternoon without saying anything in particular, just, "How's the place?" And I said, "Fine," and he nodded and walked on. I thought about that a long time. She was reading. This was April, 2 months in. I came in from the evening rounds and she was in the chair by the kitchen window with a book from the shelf. The shelf had been Mies, mostly history and some poetry. I hadn't looked at those books in years. She had her feet drawn up under her, the lamplight on the side of her face, one finger holding her place on the page. I stood in the doorway longer than I should have. She looked up. I said, "That's Mies' chair." She said, "You said I could move her things." I said, "I know what I said." She watched me a moment, then she said, "Does it bother you?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "No, it doesn't. I think she'd have liked you." Calla looked at the book for a second, then back at me. She said, "Tell me about her." I sat down. The fire was going. Outside, the wind was mild, the first real warmth of the season starting to come on. I told her about me, how we'd met in Missouri, how she'd read every book she could get her hands on and had strong opinions about all of them, how she'd run the ranch's finances with the same focus she brought to everything, how she died in her sleep on a cold night in November 11 years back, and I'd found her in the morning, and I'd never had a good explanation for why a healthy woman of 42 dies in her sleep on an otherwise ordinary night. Calla listened without filling the spaces. When I was done, she said, "She sounds like she was smart." I said, "She was the smartest person I've known." Calla nodded. She looked back at the book but didn't read. After a moment she said, "My mother was like that, before the hard years." I said, "What happened?" She talked for a while. I won't put all of it down here, it's hers, not mine to give out. The short of it is, a quarter section that went under, a father who tried everything and then stopped trying and then left, a mother who broke in the middle, a girl of 17 who found herself in circumstances that narrowed fast and then narrowed again. Reese had come in at the end of a chain of things, the way men like Reese always do. They find the end of a chain and they pick it up and they walk. When she was done, the fire had burned low. I built it back up. I stood with my back to her, working the coals, and I said, "None of that was your fault." A long silence. She said, "I know that." Said it steady. "The way you say something you've had to decide for yourself, without anyone to help you decide it." I turned around. She was looking at me, level and clear, that dark eye direct as always. I held her gaze for a moment, and then I went to the kitchen to put on coffee. Reese came back in May. This time alone. He came at mid-morning on a Thursday, without the two men, on a different horse. He tied up at the post and knocked at the front door, which was not how you came to a man's ranch if you meant trouble. You came to the door if you meant talk. I let him in. He sat at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands, which was a posture I'd never seen on him before, and he looked around the room, at the shelves, the ledger open on the table, the coffee pot on the stove, and then he looked at me. He said he'd had a visit from Aldous. I said I knew. He said, "I'm coming to settle it." I said, "It's settled." He said, "I mean properly." He put his hand in his coat and laid an envelope on the table. He said it was a written release of any claim, signed and witnessed by a notary in Millhaven, and I could have Aldous verify it if I wanted. He said the men who'd had the original claim on the woman had been paid off from his own pocket, which was, he said with a flat expression, not a comfortable thing to do. I looked at the envelope and didn't touch it. I said, why? He was quiet a moment. Then he said with an expression I couldn't entirely read, because Aldous told me what you paid for her at the auction. He paused. I know what she looked like that morning. I know what you were looking at. Another pause. I've done a lot of things. I didn't think much of them at the time. He looked at his hat. I don't know what I think now. I said, pick up your envelope and leave. He picked it up. At the door he stopped. He said, she all right? I said, she doesn't concern you. He went out. I stood at the window and watched him ride. The morning light was clean, still early, the grass starting to come green at the edges of the yard where the water ran off the roof. I heard Calla come in from the back. She'd been in the kitchen garden. She'd started a kitchen garden in April. A row of beans and one of onions and a small bed of herbs she'd ordered seeds for from a catalog. She came and stood beside me and looked out the window at Reese's back, getting small on the road. She said, was that him? I said, yes. She said, is it done? I said, I think so. She stood there a moment. Then she put her hand on my arm, just her hand, resting there on my forearm, light and certain, and she said, thank you, Harlan. First time she'd used my name. I looked at her hand and then at her face, and she was watching the road, and there was nothing performed about any of it. No drama, no ceremony. Just a woman putting her hand on a man's arm and meaning it. I said, you don't need to thank me. She said, I know I don't, and she kept her hand where it was. Summer came on. I want to tell it right, not make it something soft it wasn't. We didn't fall into each other like water, nothing like that. What happened was slower and harder and more honest. It was two people who'd each had their own rough country to cross, finding out that the other person was solid. That's the word I keep coming back to. You can be near a solid person and not feel the ground shifting. After enough years of shifting ground, that's not a small thing. She was good with the stock. Better than good, she had a patience with animals that I respected. The patience of someone who understands that you can't push a thing faster than it's able to go. You can only be consistent and wait. She could move cattle with half the noise I used. She learned the ranch the way she'd learned the ledgers thoroughly, without fuss, until she knew it better than I'd been able to explain it. She made decisions. That's the part I want to be clear about. I didn't give her orders and she didn't take them. She'd come to me in the evening and say, I'm thinking the south pasture fence needs moving, or I think we should look at a different bull next season, and she'd lay out her reasons, and I'd think about it. And sometimes I'd say she was right, and sometimes I'd say I thought she was wrong and why, and she'd push back if she thought I was wrong. We argued about the fence for 3 days. She was right about the fence. One evening in late July, she came in from the barn and sat across from me and said, without preamble, I want to stay. I said, you can stay as long as you want. This is your home. She said, that's not what I mean. I looked at her. She said, I mean I want to stay because I want to, not because I have nowhere else. She held my gaze. I have somewhere else. I had a letter from a cousin in Colorado. She'd take me in. A pause. I wrote back and told her I was all right. The lamp was between us on the table. Her face in the light, direct as always, not asking me for anything, stating a fact, offering it. I said, Calla. She said, I know you still grieve me. I said, I do. She said, I'm not asking you to stop. I said, I know. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. The same light, certain way, she had nothing theatrical about it. She said, you're a good man, Harlan Cross. You were good to me when you had no reason to be and every reason not to. I know what that cost you, the talk and the trouble, and I know you didn't do it to collect on it. She stopped. Then, I'd like to be here, with you. If you'll have me. I turned my hand over under hers. I said, I'll have you. Nothing else needed saying. The night came down outside and the lamp held its circle of light, and neither of us moved for a long time. We married in September. Aldous stood up for me. Calla had no family to bring, So she brought the woman who ran the Millhaven Dry Goods, a Mrs. Flanders, who'd taken to Calla in the way some women take to a person they recognize something in, and who cried through the whole short ceremony and was unembarrassed about it. The Valley had their opinions, same as always. Some of those opinions softened once they got their eyes on us together. There's a thing a couple can have, a fit between them that visible, and I've been told we had it. Others didn't soften, and I didn't need them to. What I had was a ranch that ran well, and a woman at my side who was able and loyal and clear-eyed, who argued with me when I was wrong and backed me when I was right, who kept me's chair at the window, and sometimes read the books me had read and once told me, looking up from one of them, that she understood now why me had such a temper about her opinions, because the man in this one was obviously wrong, and if you couldn't see that you weren't paying attention. I laughed for the first time in a long time. She looked pleased with herself, went back to reading. The last thing I'll say is this. There's a kind of man who, by the time he's lived long enough, starts to think that the best of things is behind him. Not with bitterness, just as a fact, the way the season turns and the light comes later and leaves earlier and you just note it and carry on. I was that kind of man for years. Did my work, kept my land, asked nothing from the territory and expected nothing back. What I didn't understand, and I think you need a woman like Calla to teach you this, it can't be taught in theory, is that being needed is not the same as being used. Being needed by someone who doesn't need you the way drowning is a need, but the way a good partner needs a good partner, that's different. That's what a man is built for, I think. To be the kind of steady that someone can lean against, not to be used up by it, to be built up by it. She chose me. After everything that had been done to her, with a cousin in Colorado waiting and a whole country to disappear into if she wanted, she sat across a lamp from me and said she wanted to stay. I have never been valued by anyone the way I am valued by that woman, and I have never been more certain of who I am than when I am standing next to her, and there is not a man alive who could tell me that's not worth more than all the rest of it put together. The ranch is still here. She's still here. That's all I've got to say about it.